Deanna had lived on the streets and had been in Ukraine, born there, and by the age of 10, she left her birth mother and chose the streets over the life she had had with her birth mom. Her birth mother was an alcoholic, a very angry woman, and she prostituted as well.
But the hand that holds this flailing soul, he will not let go.
Deanna was 15 when Larry and Tara Quinn adopted her. That was 15 years ago. Tara is our guest on this episode of GPS, God, People, Stories. I'm Jim Kirkland.
And I'm Phil Fleischman. Not only is our guest an adoptive parent, but I am too. My wife and I adopted a little girl.
And same for my wife and I. We are adoptive parents. We have 2 adopted girls. And you know as well as anybody, Phil, every adoption story is unique and it is special. And on this episode of GPS, Tara Quinn's going to share the unique and very special story of her daughter's adoption.
GPS. God, People, Stories.
Both Deanna and Tara Quinn were scheduled to be with us, but Deanna couldn't make it at the last minute because her 6-year-old daughter, Alexis, got sick.
Deanna is not Tara and Larry Quinn's only child. They have 2 sons whom Tara gave birth to, Clay and Aaron, and they're also the unofficial adoptive parents of another son, Charlie.
When we adopted Deanna, our oldest son was 17, Charlie was 16, Deanna was 15, and then Aaron was 13.
That was in 2001. Tara met Deanna 1 year earlier when she went on a mission trip with her oldest son, Clay, to an orphanage in Ukraine.
So in my mind, I had pictured a very sterile facility with metal beds and babies unattended and not being loved. Not that they weren't being taken care of, but as a mother of 2 children, I was sort of overwhelmed of what this was going to be. So I had spent a lot of time praying, had other people praying for me. And when I walked in that door, I was taken back. As I came to learn more about the orphanage, it was a Christian orphanage, and Roman Corneco, the man that founded the orphanage, was a believer, and you just felt the love of God in this facility when we walked in.
Tara has run a pro-life crisis pregnancy center for years, and when she felt God leading her to go on this mission trip, she assumed she'd be using her ministry experience to help the children in the orphanage.
When I went there, life was very full. I was not looking for a daughter. I wasn't looking for another child in our home. And so adoption was not even something we had even talked about. We respected that was a great decision for many people, but we just never, ever thought that's something we would be involved in.
That would change within just a few days. It began when the orphanage staff began telling Tara's and Clay's group about one specific orphan named Deanna.
Deanna had lived on the streets and had been in Ukraine, born there, and by the age of 10, she left her birth mother and chose the streets over the life she had had with her birth mom. Her birth mother was an alcoholic, a very angry woman, and she prostituted as well.
Deanna's birth mother was also abusive.
Her birth mother had placed her head on a burner at one point in time, and so she had probably 60% or 70% of her entire scalp had been burned completely off. Deanna had scars on her face where her mother would hit her. And so Deanna she wasn't educated either because her mother kept her out of schools and from really being around large groups of people because she didn't want people to know she was abusing her.
A few years before Tara met Deanna, Deanna had had reconstructive surgery to address the injuries to her head, as well as injuries to her teeth and eyes. The surgery had been performed here in the States, and it had been paid for by a businessman in Missouri.
During that time, a family in Missouri had begun the process of adopting Deanna, but the mom got sick and the family decided it couldn't go through with the adoption. So Deanna went back to Ukraine, thinking that her chances of ever being adopted were gone. But then God prompted Tara Quinn to go on that mission trip with her teenage son.
When I met Deanna, I just remember the first time I saw her, I was overwhelmed. Of course, we know that was the Holy Spirit working. And so my mother's heart was overwhelmed. All I could think about was how much I loved Clay and Aaron, and how this one girl, all orphans desire a home. They desire what's called that forever family. And so something in my heart just exploded for her. And it was a more of compassion and this desire to put my arms around her and just tell her she was loved. And so she just sort of looked up and smiled at us.
Keep your eyes on me. Though this life is hard, I will give you perfect peace.
They spent some time together after that first meeting, and then, on the last day of the mission trip, Deanna was able to spend the entire day with Tara and Clay. The goodbye was very hard.
The last time I saw Deanna on that trip, we were on a bus, and they usually have very large windows, tour buses do, and so she literally ran beside my bus window and touched the window, and I was overwhelmed, and I knew that it was bigger than just me and just an emotion, and I really felt God was beginning to do something, and He was.
Tara and Clay returned home, but Tara didn't say anything to her husband about adoption, not for about 2 weeks. Instead, she spent that time talking to God about it.
I knew that this was something that I needed the whole family to want to be a part of, that Deanna didn't need just a mother or just a father. She needed a family. And so my last thing that I told the Lord was, my whole family has to be in agreement, or I can't do this, Lord, because this could tear my family apart.
As it turned out, the whole family was in agreement. So Tara and Larry began the adoption process. It took about a year, but Tara and Deanna came home together in March of 2001.
We landed and got back in the country on my birthday. So I joke and say I gave birth to her on my birthday.
The flight from Ukraine to the United States was a long one, but it was nothing compared to the journey that lay ahead for the Quinn family.
My daughter was 15 years old when she came to us. There had been so much brokenness in her life. There was the physical abuse. There was the rejection from 2 families. And so we had no understanding of the depth of that brokenness within her.
I've known rejection. I've bought the lie that I could never overcome the hurt inside.
That brokenness made it nearly impossible for Deanna to trust her parents. It made it hard for her to understand family life. It led her to sabotage good situations just so she could retain control of the outcome.
There were many times when all I could do was look her in the eye and say, I am your mother, and you are my daughter, and I love you. And, we've said that with tears. We've said it with loud voices. We've said it through a lot of pain. But she'll tell you, my mother prays, and my mother never gave up on me.
Nope, neither Tara nor Larry ever gave up on their daughter. But they often asked themselves, what were we thinking?
We had no idea. And but we were committed. We were committed to the purposes and plans of God. We were committed to this daughter. And so there were many days when we didn't have answers, when it was hard. Deanna, I would say one of the saving graces for us with some of the challenges was that Deanna was in a Christian orphanage. And Deanna did know the Lord, but the broken places, she wasn't real good about letting the Lord in.
This past year has brought about a lot of restoration in Tara and Deanna's relationship. Tara says they began to experience something she calls Forgiveness Fridays.
We had a season where Fridays I'm off, and I would call and say, Deanna, why don't you come walk? I like to walk in the mornings. And out of that just began a pathway for us as we were walking, and we live out in the country. So it wasn't like we were somewhere where we could just walk a loop and go get in our car and leave. So once you got out on the path, you were out in the country. So God would begin to open up these conversations, and they were painful because we had both hurt each other in the midst of things. And just the grace we had for each other to forgive. We need to walk in forgiveness. You know, we think sometimes that forgiveness is a one-time decision, but I think with Deanna and I, we can look back and forgiveness needs to be a lifestyle because we all hurt each other, no matter husbands and wives, friends, children, families. So I think just to understand, we have to learn to walk in forgiveness, and you do have to have God's grace.
Do you remember ever knowing anyone who saw you as someone who called you by name and said, forgiven?
Tara Quinn and her family discovered that God's grace can transform your life and your relationships in a way nothing else can. Do you sense that you need to experience that kind of transformation? We would be blessed and delighted to help you with that. Go to our website, findpeacewithgod.net. That's findpeacewithgod.net.
The transformation that God worked in the Quinn family has led Tara and Deanna to begin doing ministry together. Tara's going to share a story about that in just a minute.
You're listening to GPS, God, People, Stories, a podcast production of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association.
The first thing that God did after creation was to establish the home.
Billy Graham.
Is there love in your home? Loving your children through the teenage period. Now that's difficult, but do it. They're going to have their moments of rebellion. They're finding themselves. They're growing from teenagers to adults, and they have a real tough time. And during that period of time, parents should love and advise and counsel, but most of all, love. Would you let Christ come to your house today? Would you let him come to your heart? You see, Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sins. We've all sinned, every one of us. We're all in the same boat. We're all sinners, and the boat is sinking. The wages of sin is death, but he came and took the death and the judgment and the hell that we deserved on the cross, and he says, I love you. I want to forgive you. I want to come into your life. I want to come into your heart. I want to come into your home. I'm asking you to let him tonight.
And now back to the hosts of GPS, Phil Fleischman and Jim Kirkland.
A classic Billy Graham message. If you don't know, I want to share with you that you can have messages just like the one you heard delivered right to your inbox. Plus, every week's episode of this program, GPS. All you need to do is go to billygraham.org/subscriptions. Once you're there, enter your email address. Just look for the Billy Graham Radio email newsletter. That's billygraham.org/subscriptions.
Our guest on this episode of GPS has been telling the story of how God has worked in her and her adoptive daughter's life. Tara Quinn says she and Deanna have had some rough patches in their relationship, but now the two women have begun ministering to other adoptive families. Tara says they recently spoke at a conference in Iowa.
We had one woman who came up to us, and she and her husband had 3 natural children, and they have 2 adoptive children from Russia. And so their daughter is out of high school now, but in a real rebellious time. And some of the things that I shared on the platform, they were like, that has happened in our home. But, I think our story gives hope. And I think it's one of hope when we share it together.
We want to thank Tara Quinn for being with us on this episode of GPS, and we want to thank Deanna for allowing her mom to share her story. Also, a big thank you to Laura Story for the use of some of her music, and of course, we want to thank you for listening. This is GPS, God, People, Stories. I'm Phil Fleischman.
And I'm Jim Kirkland. GPS is an outreach of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. Always good news.
I've been living like an orphan, trying to belong here, but it's just not my home. I've been holding on so tightly to all the things that I think that satisfy my soul, but I'm letting go. Please be my guide, be my guide, so I can just be me, so I can just be me, I can just be me.